I'm Paulina, and I'll make an introduction to developing standalone integrations using Milestone Integration Platform SDK. In this presentation, I will first talk a bit about what the standalone integrations are and how to get started with development of those. Then I'll go into more technical details about the Milestone SDK library. I'll talk about how you can utilize some of the basic functionality in your applications and how you can start development of your own applications. In the end, I will make a code walkthrough of two of the sample integrations using the MIP SDK. Let's start with defining what the standalone integrations are. The standalone integrations are those type of integrations where you want to have access to the VMS, you want to communicate with the VMS, but you don't necessarily need your application to run in the Xprotect applications. When you look at the MIP SDK documentation page, you will often see that we refer to the standalone integrations as the component integrations. The reason for doing that is because those type of integrations use MIP components to communicate with Milestone Integration Platform. Those components are being distributed by a NuGet package. The NuGet package is currently only available for the .NET Framework integrations. We are currently in the process of migrating the whole Xprotect suite to .NET, but it's a long process, and SDK will also come with .NET support at some point, but we will not do a rewrite of an old SDK. We want to start from the scratch and have a modern SDK which follows the best practices. Now we have defined what the standalone integrations are. Let's talk about the functionality which you can find in the SDK. And this functionality you can also use in your applications. The functionality available can be grouped into 4 different areas. And for each of the area we have samples showing how to implement the functionality. We have over 50 samples, so there is a lot to choose from. So the first area is authentication. So you can log into the system, to the VMS using the SDK. Then you have access to the configuration data, and you can also monitor the status of server, cameras, or events triggered in the system. You can also access video, audio, and metadata. You can view live and playback video and audio and metadata. You can do video and audio export. You can retrieve raw video data or listen to incoming audio from microphone and sending audio to a speaker of the camera. Then the last area of the functionality is control and data injection. And what you can do with SDKs, for example, you can create and manage bookmarks, evidence logs, or video restrictions. You can also do PTZ controls or send logs to the log server. So now if you want to start development of component integrations, there is a few resources to look at. First of all, we have a whole section in the SDK documentation where you can find a list of all the samples we have available. Then we also have samples uploaded on GitHub, and you can find it in their own repository. We have a NuGet package which contains the libraries for all the components of the MIP SDK. And finally, we have a template, the Visual Studio template, which allows you to create a template for a standalone integration. And I will now switch to a short demo of how to use that template. So let's see, let's create a new project and select MIP library. That's a third name for the component integrations. So that's the template you should use. I'll choose a name and create a project. Once this is done, you can see that you already have a template of your application. It's a WPF application, and we can build this. And it already builds, and it can run as well. So when I run this, I'm presented here. This is so-called dialog login form. It's a Windows form which allows you to log into to the system. The limitation is that you can only connect to one server at a time, but you might also notice that most of the samples use the dialog login form. However, it's not that commonly used in the real-life integrations. So now I can press connect, and here when I'm presented with that window, I'm already connected to the VMS and logged in. One thing I wanted to point out here is that once the project based on the template is built, the required NuGet packages for doing the integration are already included in the application. So now let's move on to talk a bit more about technical details of what the .NET library contains and what you can do with it. So the implementation of .NET library consists of 6 areas, each of which provides different functionality. The DLLs, which are those areas are implemented in different DLLs, and all those DLLs come in the NuGet package I mentioned before. So if we start from the top, the most basic one is the Videos Platform SDK component, and that provides you with the base implementation and configuration access functionality. Then we have the Platform SDK UI, which contains some UI controls which are only relevant for standalone integrations. And actually most of the UI controls come defined in the Videos platform, which is a common DLL for both standalone integrations and plugin integrations. Then we have 2 components, SDK Media and SDK Export, which allows you to stream from live media sources and to access the stored media sources. Lastly, we have 2 smallest components. We have a component to send logs to the log server, and we also have a component to manage the remote retrieval of the recordings from the remote cameras. Most of those components require initialization. There is only one, the remote retrieval task, which do not require initialization. And when we look later into the code, I will point out how the initialization is being done. In the MIP SDK, we have 3 so-called environments. Those environments define how we store the configuration data for the user and how many sites you can connect to. So you can only use one environment at a time in your integration, so you should choose wisely based on the use case of your application. There are 2 deciding factors. The first one is whether you want one common configuration per user, or whether you want one common configuration or a configuration per user. Another factor is how many sites you want to connect to. So if we start from the top, we have environment, which is the one most commonly used, and it's an environment which allows you to connect to multiple VMS sites, but you only have one configuration per user. And then we have two environments, multi-environment and multi-user environment, which allows for storing configuration per user, but multi-environment allows you to connect to many sites, many VMS sites, and multi-user environment only allows to connect to one VMS site. And before we go more into how we use the environments and how you should use them to log in your application, I want to cover some common terms which are relevant for all the environments during the login process. So first of all, there is 3 different credential types which are being supported in the SDK. We have basic user, Windows user, as well as OAuth token support. And it can be an OAuth token from the identity provider which comes with the X-Protect, but it can also be a third-party identity provider like Okta, for example. Then we have 3 types of supported credentials, and SDK provides helper methods for handling those login credentials. We have network credential, credential cache, and then the last group is a credential for token. It's either MIP token cache for internal IDP, and there is a manual MIP token cache for third-party providers. The difference between those two token cache credentials is that the MIP token cache handles the refresh automatically, whereas the manual MIP token cache, you have to handle it yourself. Then we have login settings. Login settings is a class which has a property to contain a token of a login for one server. It is created once the user logs in successfully, and it can only be used for one user. Then we have user context, and user context is a class which contains a list of login settings of a user, and it is the user context which allows for storing a configuration per user. So this is what's being used in multi-environment and multi-user environment. The last thing is that we have 2 parameters in the login method, and that is secure only and master only. And those are both Boolean parameters. The first one, secure only, describes whether you want to allow the authentication over HTTPS only, or you want to allow authentication over both HTTP and HTTPS. The last one, the master only parameter, is only relevant for when you have a site which is part of the Milestone federated architecture and has child sites. And what it means is that when master only is set to true, it means that you only want to log into the master site and not log into the child sites. And this is an optional parameter, so you don't have to provide it at all if it's not relevant for you. And by default, this is set to false. So now let's go into details about the login process in each of the environment. So the first one, the one which is most commonly used, where you can have only one configuration per user, but you can log into many VMS sites. And I actually want to switch to the code of one of the samples. As I mentioned before, most of the samples, they use dialog login form to log into, so they don't use the code for the environment login. But we have one sample called camera stream resolution, where we don't use the dialog login form, but we use the methods from the environment itself. So here at the beginning, you can see that we initialize the environments we're going to be using in that application. So we have the general environment initialization and then media and export component initialization. Further down, we have a method, login method, where we first built the user credentials using the helper methods available in the SDK. Afterwards, we take those credentials and add them, and we link them to a specific server to log into. That means that in the login process, in the login method, we actually don't need to pass on credentials anymore. We only put the URI of the server we want to log into, and then that's it. You might notice that we have some additional parameters here in the login method. Those integration ID, integration name, and so on. Those are parameters which enable Milestone and partners to gain insights on where the integrations are used. There are also a few other methods I wanted to point out. Here we have Video's Platform SDK Environment Class Reference from the Milestone Integration Platform SDK documentation. So yeah, we have add server methods. If you want to use the OAuth token, there is a special version of that add server method called add server OAuth, and that one allows you to pass on the token cache as a parameter. Then we also have a method called load configuration. That method is it's optional to call because by default the configuration is loaded when you first try to access the configuration. However, that might not be quite handy because loading the configuration, if the configuration is really big, might take quite some time. So it sometimes might be a good idea to call that method right after login method in a separate thread so that the configuration is loaded once the user wants to access it, and in that way the response will be much faster. The last method I wanted to point out is the load side item method, and it's a bit of a special method because most of the methods in the environment, they require the user to be logged in first. But the load side item is a method which do not require you to be logged in, and what you can do with it is that you can load the site information, including the child sites, but not add it to the configuration in your application. So that was the login process in the environment. Now let's move on to the login process in the multi-environment. So the multi-environment is the environment where you store the configuration per user and you can connect to many VMS sites. Multi-environment makes it possible to combine data from several sites, and it is an alternative to the Milestone federated architecture. The multi-environment, if you are familiar with the XProtect ecosystem, it is used internally by the interconnect solution. So the difference between the multi-environment and the environment shown on the previous slide is that here we start operating on the user context. And I will also now, I want to show you one of the sample which utilize the multi-environment, which is called the System Status Client Console. And in this application here, you can see in line 36 that we initialize the environment using the multi-environment. So it's a bit different compared to the previous sample we looked at, where we utilized the environment to initialize it. Then in the next line, we create a user context, and then we log in user context for that user. Once the user is logged in, the user context is being used to get the configuration for that user. So for example, here in line 52, we can see that we can get the server FQID of the server the user logged into. So lastly, we have the multi-user environment, and this is the environment where you can have configuration per user, but you can only have one VMS site. And then that type of environment, it requires an overall user for communication with the server and keeping the configuration updated. And it is usually some kind of a system or service user. And again, this type of environment is used internally in the Xprotect, and it is used by the mobile server implementation. And I will now again switch to the sample, which uses the multi-user environment. And here we can see that we first initialize using user context. So that's the initialization method of the environment for the multi-user environment. And when we initialize the multi-user environment, we already pass on the credentials of that service user to log into. Then for the user context, we have a separate control in the sample where we first create the user context and then the login user context. And we can have multiple user contexts created in the application for different users. I also mentioned that the service user is used for keeping the configuration updated, and the sample demonstrates that too. This is done by first registering a receiver for receiving a message when the system configuration changes. And then we create a system monitor which handles when the system configuration changed indication is raised, and it updates the configuration of the user in the user context. The last thing I wanted to briefly touch on about is hosting MIP SDK application on the IIS. In principles, we develop and test MIP SDK library only for desktop applications. The library contains some unmanaged DLLs which are not being loaded by IIS by default. And if you want to host your application on IIS, you have to do some tricks. You have to modify the system environment path to point out to the folder where the MIP SDK DLLs are. And we have a knowledge-based article on that, which you can find on the documentation page. The alternative to when you want to have an application hosted on IIS and you want to connect to the VMS system, you can use protocol integration or you can use mobile SDK libraries. So now let's go to some sample code. I will open the first sample, and I think I will start with doing a demo of what the sample does. The sample I will start with is called Image Viewer Client, and what it does is that it allows you to log into a system, and then you can select a camera from that system. And you can switch from live and playback mode. There are some image viewer properties you can play with. For example, there is a digital zoom, so you can zoom in and out. And there are also some playback controller properties and some other properties to control the playback video displayed in the application. So now let's into how this is implemented. So this is a WPF application where here you can see that we have two controls from the VDOS platform DLL added. We have the image viewer control and playback user control. The image viewer control is a control which displays the stream of the video and the image viewer control is associated with the camera when the camera is being selected. So here we have the load camera code, and you can see that we have an instance of the image viewer controller where we set the camera FQID once the camera is selected. The next thing is the playback user control, and actually what I wanted to first talk about is a class called playback controller, because the playback controller is something very important for when you want to play playback and you want to synchronize and connect the image viewer control and the playback user control. The playback controller makes sure that the video corresponds to what's being selected on the timeline in the playback user control. So here in the sample you can see that we first generate the playback controller, we save its FQID, and then in the next line we associate this playback controller with the playback user control. Later on, once we load the camera, we also associate the same camera, we also associate the image viewer control with the same playback FQID. When you have some audio streams, you also have to associate them with the playback controller. And this is done here in load microphone and load speaker methods. And the way you associate those with the playback controller is that you first create an audio player for either speaker or microphone, and then you associate it with the playback controller created before. The playback is controlled using messaging. So when we enable playback, we send a message that we want to change the mode of the client to the playback mode. Once we want to go back to the live mode, we send the same message, but just with a different mode passed on as a parameter. The last thing I wanted to show in that sample is working in the offline mode. So the sample also allows you to load the export from the smart client with a CP extension. And this is an offline export. That means that you can log in to that system and load the configuration from the export and basically have the same experience as you would operate on the live system, just with the exported data. The next sample I wanted to talk about is the alarm and event viewer sample. And this is a sample which operates on alarms and events triggered in the system. And I will again start with demonstrating how the sample works. So here you can see that I have a list of existing alarms and existing events in the system. I will now switch to the management client where I have an event defined. So let's say I'll trigger this event, and once the event is triggered successfully, I can see that it has appeared here in the sample. This event is also, so the event is here actually, and that event is associated with an alarm which has also been triggered by that event, and you can see that the alarm is listed here. Alarms support updating data of the alarm. So here, if you look at the state number, I will now change it to in progress, and you can see that the alarm state, the data has been updated to in progress state. So if we now look into the code of that sample, we will see that when we want to load the existing alarms, we get hold of the alarm client manager, which has a method to get alarms from the system. The same alarm client can be used for retrieving the event lines. So there is also get event lines method in that client. And as a response, you get a list of existing alarms which match the filter defined in the method. And then you can do whatever you need with those alarms. The sample also shows how to listen on new and changed alarms, as well as events. Then I will then the way this is done is by subscribing to either alarms changes or event changes. Then if we look at the subscribe alarms method, this is again done by registering a communication filter on either new alarm indication or changed alarm indication. And then we pass on, we define a method which is being triggered once the message with a given with a given name appears in the system. For events, it is only possible to subscribe to new events indication because events do not support updating the data of the event. So if we want to update the data of the event and of the alarm and want to send it back to the VMS, this can be done by again getting hold of the alarm client, and then there is a method called update alarm which sends the updated alarm to the system. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.